You could say basically that there are 5 forms of homeopathy, research in homeopathy. The first has been what I call basic science. That is, studies on the basic physics of what is a homeopathic remedy. The second is on how homeopathic remedies affect simple systems, such as enzymatic reactions, cell cultures, and things of that sort. The third is research on homeopathic remedies on animals. The fourth would be clinical trials. The last and least developed so far is research for homeopaths on homeopathy. So the first series of things that have been done are on what is a homeopathic dilution anyway. Frequently they're called ultra dilutions. And the reason that they're called that is because it's dilutions beyond the point where there should be anything left to dilute, beyond Avogadro's number. It's certainly been well known through all sorts of well-accepted scientific research that very tiny amounts of substances can influence greatly larger amounts of substance, like adding very tiny amounts of vanadium to steel changes tensile strengths and melting properties and so forth for huge quantities of steel. So way beyond what the small amount of the vanadium could explain, or titanium or what have you. And so most of the research on the basic physics of what a homeopathic remedy is, or what an ultra dilution is, have centered around this concept of changes within the solvent. If you dissolve salt in water, you end up with a sodium molecule and a chlorine molecule, and you end up with the little dipoles of the water molecule having a heavy oxygen atom with 2 very tiny hydrogen atoms attached, and the nucleus of the oxygen atom tends to shift the electron from the hydrogen towards the oxygen, and it creates what's called a dipole. So it becomes a slightly charged end, like a little magnet, really. So you have a positive end and a negative end of the molecule, where the electron's been pulled away from the hydrogen, so it's become slightly electropositive, and the oxygen molecule takes on more of the electronic charge, so it becomes slightly electronegative. So it's like a little magnet sitting there in water. So you have a sodium atom which is dissolved in the water, and it's positive. So what happens is the negative charged ends of the water molecule all surround this positively charged sodium atom, and that's actually how that's how it dissolves in the water, is that the many negative ends of the water molecules balance out the positive sodium atom, the charge of the sodium atom. Otherwise you'd have these electric charges floating free, and that just doesn't happen in nature, where there's a positive and negative always has to come to counterbalance it. So as this sodium atom is out in solution and you have these water molecules surrounding it, it's very well known in chemistry that these atoms surround it in a very particular configuration, which is specific only to a sodium atom, a dissolved sodium atom. Because of its size, because of its configuration, water will arrange itself around it completely differently than it will around, say, a calcium atom or any other atom that's being dissolved in the water. This is well accepted in every scientific circle. Now what the current theory is of how the remedy works is that this arrangement of water molecules, which is not just one layer thick, but it's actually many layers thick of water molecules which arrange themselves, that somehow this arrangement can be maintained in a stable form even as you dilute out the sodium and chloride out of the water. So the idea is that information is encoded to the solvent through the succussion process. And it's often stated that, you have to have, it can't be done in a vacuum. There's been studies showing that homeopathic remedies made in a vacuum are inactive. So there's something to do possibly with tiny bubbles of air around which these stable arrangements take place. Some physicists said then, okay, if that's the case, that these arrangements are changed and it has to do with these structures in the water, then we should be able to see this on the basis of, magnetic resonance imaging, or NMR. And what this guy did was he took sulfur 30C and he compared it to placebo 30C. In other words, a vial of water that had gone through all the same succussion and dilution process. He compared the two, and he was able to determine a very distinct difference in the hydrophilic bonding of the water alcohol solution that he was doing this with. And this has been repeated once or twice since then. And also it's been failed to be reproduced once or twice since then. Some people have tried to reproduce it without any results. The next advance in this theory of stable water molecules was made by this guy named Lowe. He's an associate professor at Caltech, which is a pretty prestigious institution. He was working in industry trying to create a better catalytic converter for automobiles. And so they were trying various different substances to run car exhaust fumes through and seeing which things absorb the sulfur dioxide the best. And they tried a whole variety of different kinds of absorbent material. And somebody gave him a sample and said, try running it through on this. And so they ran it through this liquid, and it had the best absorbent qualities of any of the substances that they'd been trying. And they got very excited, and they took the liquid and they analyzed it, and it was pure water. And so they contacted the guy and they said, what's the story? Because they tried other samples of water and it didn't work at all. And he finally confided to them that it was basically a homeopathic dilution of sulfur dioxide, like run up to about 30C. So our topic for this morning is the organon. It's amazing how relevant Hahnemann's thoughts and ideas still are today. I mean, you can take one of our most profound lectures, where we tell you these deep secrets of homeopathy, and if you look at it carefully, Hahnemann said almost everything that we're saying. So the thought is still very relevant. And it's also relevant to know the beginnings of some of the ideas that were developed by later thinkers like Vithulkas or Sankrin and Pasquero, so that we can see how these ideas, the lineage of the ideas, springs from the organon. And it gives a context for most of the theoretical considerations that have come since. All of Kant's philosophy, his lectures on homeopathic philosophy, are basically commentaries on the organon. And you could think of Vithulkas's Science of Homeopathy as basically comments on Kant's comments on the organon. These thoughts have been mined and remined over and over again through the history of homeopathy. Just when you think people have said everything that there is to be said about the organon, they go back in and they look at it. They look at it with fresh eyes, and new jewels come out of that same matrix. The organon, of course, the first edition was in 1810. So what is that? Just short of 200 years ago. 190 years ago that the first edition of the Organon was published. And Hahnemann was at that time age 55. It went through four more editions, the last of which, the fifth edition, was published in 1833, about 5 years after the first publication of Chronic Diseases. And in the first four editions of the Organon, basically no mention of the word miasm came forward, and it's only in the fifth edition, which was published 5 years later, that we see the concept of miasm filtering into the Organon. And Hahnemann was at that time age 78. There were two very excellent, famous translations of the fifth edition. The one which I love the most is by Wesselhoft, and I just think he has a much more poetic nature. The sixth edition was basically a heavily annotated and scratched out version of the fifth edition of the Organon, or the last annotations of which occurred in 1842, 1 year before Hahnemann's death at the age of 88. What is an organon? The literal meaning is a tool or a vehicle for some action. That's what an organ is. It comes from the base syllable werg, W-E-R-G, which is the same root words for energy, and ergy, E-R-G, erg, or ergs, like in the denomination of work, from physics. And also the same root word for orgasm, and also for organize or organism. And it comes from the very basic concept of growing from, of growth and spreading, and a vehicle for growth. But organon itself is defined as a set of principles. And that's what the organon of the art of medicine is. It's divided into basically two sections. The first section is his lengthy preface. It's about 60 pages, outlining first the various schools of medical practice and theories of biology. It defines the concepts of homeopathy and coins the word homeopathy and the words allopathy, antipathy, and endiopathy, which is more or less the same, and isopathy. So it brings forward these concepts to put in context the different natures of medical systems, defining these systems in terms of their method of confronting the symptomatology of the disease. It's a wonderful preface. It has very little relevance for people except from the historical standpoint, the history of medicine, but it gives a lot of insight into Hahnemann's struggles and his nature as a person and so forth. And then we have the second section is the organon proper, which in the sixth edition is composed of some 291 aphorisms, along with multiple footnotes to well over half of the aphorisms, and sometimes even footnotes to the footnotes in the sixth edition. The fifth edition has 292 aphorisms. However, many of these aphorisms are combined in the sixth edition and abbreviated, and many of the aphorisms in the sixth edition, even though there's one fewer aphorisms, are completely original new expansions of the work. Now, there's an interesting tidbit in history here which is of extreme relevance, and it reads almost like a John Grisham novel.